first time I've mentioned the very important man, the invisible man behind the camera. But I'm going to say something about him today. He's an important part of this project, and I'm going to describe something of which he's an exemplar of, and this is not so much a biographical treatment as an exemplary treatment of a certain kind of character, an interest of character. Because today I'm going to talk about the problem of growing up and the problem of what it means to know the thing that you believe in a way that is mature. And it's a very tricky subject and very difficult subject. Now, the man behind the camera, although he did spend time in public school and was an aficionado of rock and roll and some elements of Americana, and in some very important ways a typical gentleman of United States culture. Nonetheless, having said that much, he has a certain kind of cultural eccentricity, which is very interesting, which is that he grew up in that very small minority of American families where the definitive, exemplary, determinative element in their life is religion. And in this case, Catholicism, although one could show a parallel in a family where Protestantism or Orthodox Judaism had the same absolutely defining role. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, I don't mean by this that the family was Orthodox or that they were believers or that they went to church, because that's true of millions of people who are not guided fundamentally and daily by the life of the church and by the actual mechanisms and structures of ecclesiastical life. So, we all know that many religious people either are religious only when asked, and so if they're pushed, do you believe in God? Yes, I believe in God. Are you a member of a church? Yes, I have faith. Do you believe in the Bible? And I'm not questioning those people's veracity or sincerity on that question at all. But they do not, in everyday life, make judgments, minute moral, personal judgments, and decide their schedule and activities largely based on their connection to a church or to a religious ideal. And but in the case of somebody like the man behind the camera, he grew up in an ethos where there was a centrality, an enormous centrality was given to all the accoutrements of the Catholic faith. So the catechism, the being an altar boy, participating in Mass, the liturgy, the holy days, the prelacy and hierarchy and priesthood and ceremonial aspects and all the other layer upon layer upon layer which constitutes the life of the church, including as he got older, in his teenage years and later, dogmatic and intellectual interest in traditio, meaning the intellectual tradition, and but his family and himself were guided by a very strict concern and interest in the life of the church, and it was as if you could draw a line from their home to the parish, to the diocese, a relation to the pastor, to the local deacon, to the bishop, to the pope, and there was like a line from place X to Rome, and this line defined a central relation in the everyday life of the person, which is not true, actually, of a majority of Roman Catholics. I myself am a late convert to Catholicism. I know something about different kinds of Catholics and different styles of Catholicism. And it's my experience that no more than 5% of Roman Catholics, that's probably an exaggeration, but no more than 5% have this kind of intense, definitive religion, meaning that it's the fallback essence of their determination of the way they see their life. Now, because I grew up in a different world, I had a very different origin of my own self-consciousness. So when I was a child, I was in an agnostic family. My mother was a silent Protestant. My father was a vocal agnostic and was particularly negative about Catholicism. For whatever reason, it was probably an inheritance of his Unitarian, Presbyterian, Anglican background of his family, which are traditions which are either blatantly or casually anti-Catholic. So I remember that as part of his religious. But his life was not religious. There was no participation in church. There was no thought about the Holy Calendar. The only holiday we ever celebrated really at all was Christmas in the American way, in the modern Dickensian way. Now, my mother took it seriously, and we'd sometimes read the Bible story or something because she thought it should be somehow not just a commercial venture. But in fact, that was the only glancing moment of the year when there was even this element of specifically Christian presence. So what took its place? Because almost everybody has something that guides them, although there may be a class of people who are not guided by any external intellectual or spiritual structure whatsoever. That's a possibility. But in my life, it was the civic religion of the United States that dominated my consciousness. My father was an attorney, a district attorney, served the county, Lancaster County in Pennsylvania. He was a believer in the American system. He was a conservative law and order personality. He was very concerned about American history. And as a small boy, as soon as I learned to read at 5 or 6, actually I could read earlier. I think I learned to read when I was about 4. But by the time I was 5 or 6, 7, I was already reading about battles in American history, about the Constitution. And from that time down to my college years, it was an overwhelming presence in my consciousness. So if you went into my room, unlike, I'm guessing, the room of the man behind the camera, which probably had medals and religious objects and statuary, and my room had a painted metal statue of George Washington. It had paintings of Jefferson and Lincoln. It had a small reprinted copy of the Declaration. It had a whole shelf of Americana, of little blue books that you read, the key books of American culture, like the Bunker Hill Oration, the Farewell Address of Washington, the Gettysburg Address, Webster's orations in the Senate, Burke's reconciliation speech with the colonies, and things of, Henry Clay and Patrick Henry's Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death speech. And these things I read with absolute devotion and internalized it as a way of thinking about my world. So the man behind the camera, as I recall, one of his big travels in life, where I don't think he did a lot of international traveling, was he went to Brazil to see the Pope when he was a teenager. Well, when I was a teenager, I went to battlefields and to the Washington, D.C., and it was like a pilgrimage. Okay, I could see Gettysburg and Vicksburg and Culpeper and Brandywine, and these were enormously important emotional fulfillments, fulfilling my already imaginative understanding of these historical events and this quasi-religious culture of the civic life of America. Now, we all know that one side of American culture is its internalized democratic principles and a certain kind of civic ideal, as if it had a religious nature. Now, my point today is that if we take the man behind the camera or the man in front of the camera, they both had to learn to grow up. And growing up intellectually and morally is partly recognizing the reality of that governing principle which you internalize as a child. One part of that is realizing your parents are like other people and make mistakes and do good things and bad things like other people. That's part of the most central psychological development of individuals, that idea. But along with that, and along with coming to understand your hometown and your ethos that you grow up in a more objective way, and seeing it in relation to other things in the world, along with that, is coming to grips with the reality of the things you believe, the things you believe. And in my case, it was a slow process. I was tremendously conservative and idealistic during the war when I was an undergraduate. But years after that, I came to realize that Vietnam was the kind of mistake people say it was, both ideologically and practically. I came to see the price people paid to build America, that the manifest destiny included the destruction of Native American culture, which is an undeniable reality of the history. And you can say, well, you can say it was the destiny of Europeans, but it's still there's a ruthless element to it. And once you hear all the stories of the campaigns and the neglect of Native people, and there's no way around the scope of it. And the same thing might be true of our race history, starting with slavery, which was constitutionalized and then fought out legally till the Civil War, and then another 100 years after that to produce any kind of practical equity. And these things then I internalized as realities that took something out of my really highly idealistic picture of American culture and American democracy. I started to see the weakness of democratic institutions in certain respects. I started to see the failure of democratic action and of American action in the world. Also, one sees the benefit of American culture. One sees the World War II bolstering and saving Europe, and the Marshall Plan, and these were self-sacrificing, unusual actions in history, but they're only part of a large, complicated pattern. And now that you grow up, you reach an age, you reach the age of 30, you reach the age of 40, you can live with the reality of the thing you idealize, and then you can rebuild that ideal in a way that's rational and balanced. And I think the same holds, oddly, for the church as it would hold for the state. We've now lived through horrible disjunctions in the church, not only debates about orthodoxy and doctrines and an obvious multiple and shifting tradition, but we've also learned about corruption. And that was shocking when we're talking about people who gave up their life for the highest ideal, which is to imitate Christ. And anybody who has any idea what it means to imitate Christ will be horrified and shocked by abuse of sexual abuse, psychological abuse, abuse of power, abuse of the Vatican Bank, all these abuses seem so far away from the ideal of Christ, the original, the master, the rabbi, the Lord, the Savior, the Messiah. This seems to have departed from his ideal so far. But growing up has two elements. Growing up isn't just rejecting. It is a lot of college students reject their religion, whether Catholic or Protestant, because they think they know something now. They see through it. It's not, it's a phony, okay. They see through it. That's not growing up either. That's just being a chameleon. It's not growing up to reject out of hand civic history and the vitality and benefits of American citizenship, and it isn't growing up to reject the fundamental spiritual claims of deep down biblical and sacramental and papal, within the limited frame of the understanding, infallibility. Because all of these are infallible spiritual benefits of being a member of the church, and they exist inside the same church, which is capable of corruption, historical ambiguity, unsolvable intellectual paradoxes and problems. All these exist together. And the mature person sees this, and it's the definition of growing up wherever you start from. I think today there's a class of people, for example, that, and I find this very odd and interesting, their sexual life is their definitive mark of their character. So somebody's going to have a sex change. They think, what is gender, and which gender am I? What will I become? And then, of course, this is a decentering thing that makes life very ambiguous and difficult. But even that person has to grow through and out of that to come to an understanding that's supra-sexual in order to make sense out of that and not become a victim of conceiving of their life in the narrow terms of sexuality rather than some more fundamental. And so, I mean, there's 1,000 ways to grow up and 1,000 possible internalized models of life. Some of them are intrinsically destructive, but many of them are basically good. But they're only as good as a realistic view and a maturing understanding of them can grant because of their human participation in human culture and human history. Anyway, so that was the theme today. How do we grow up and how do we preserve our ideals in a way that makes them permanently valuable and useful to us?